For millions of years, humanity has stood upon the dry shores, looking at the dark oceans with a mixture of profound awe and instinctual terror. We recognize, deep within our primal subconscious, that the aquatic abyss is an ancient alien realm that fundamentally rejects human biology. Yet, driven by intoxicating arrogance, we continuously attempt to conquer the very environments designed to destroy us. We convince ourselves that our mastery of physics and engineering has granted us dominion over the deep. We construct colossal leviathans out of forged titanium and heavy steel, turning them into invisible phantoms of the sea. We pack their iron bellies with the fires of split atoms, plunging them into a freezing void untouched by the sun. But the bottom of the ocean is not our world. It does not belong to us, and it never will. It is a merciless graveyard ruled by crushing physical pressure, terrifying isolation, and eternal pitch-black darkness. It is a hostile environment that tolerates no human error, punishing our hubris with inescapable finality. And occasionally, that dark abyss rises up to swallow the very machines we deemed invincible. This is the harrowing chronicle of a technological marvel that became a suffocating iron tomb. This is the tragedy of the Russian nuclear submarine K-141 Kursk. The year was 2000. It was the unpredictable, stormy month of August. In the freezing, turbulent waters of the Barents Sea, the Russian Northern Fleet was conducting a triumphant naval exercise. It was the largest deployment of Russian naval power since the collapse of the Soviet Union a decade prior. It was a deliberate geopolitical statement to the watching world. The Russian bear still possessed its terrifying claws, and the absolute pride of this massive armada, the jewel of the Russian Navy, was the Kursk. The Kursk was an Oscar II-class cruise missile submarine, an apocalyptic weapon of truly unimaginable scale, stretching over 154 meters in length, longer than 2 jumbo jets, and towering 4 stories high into the Arctic air. It was relentlessly powered by 2 humming nuclear reactors, capable of silently hunting its prey in the deepest trenches of the Earth. Built with a double-hulled outer skin of thick steel, Russian naval commanders arrogantly boasted that the Kursk was fundamentally unsinkable. It was a sprawling, submerged city of war, carrying an elite crew of 118 sailors and commanding officers. On the quiet morning of August 12th, the Kursk slipped beneath the gray waves, preparing to conduct a routine simulated torpedo attack. The crew stationed in the cramped forward compartments was ordered to load a dummy Type 65 practice torpedo. It was a standard procedure, a maneuver these men had performed safely hundreds of times before. But deep inside the dark, heavy metal casing of that specific torpedo, a microscopic flaw had been sleeping quietly for years. A single faulty weld, an invisible crack in the internal architecture of the torpedo's volatile fuel tank. The Type 65 torpedo utilized high-test hydrogen peroxide as fuel, an incredibly energetic and dangerously unstable chemical compound. As the crew prepared the heavy green weapon for launch, the microscopic weld finally gave way under the shifting pressure. The concentrated hydrogen peroxide leaked out, immediately reacting with the torpedo's internal brass and copper components. The chemical reaction was instantaneous, devastating, and entirely uncontrollable, expanding the liquid into gas at thousands of times its original volume. At exactly 11:28 a.m., a violent explosion ripped through the forward torpedo room of the sealed submarine. The sheer concussive force instantly killed the men stationed in the very front of the ship. Searing heat flooded the forward compartments, tearing through the thick metal bulkheads and destroying the command center. The mighty, unsinkable Kursk, fatally wounded in the nose and rapidly taking on water, lost all mechanical control. The massive steel leviathan plunged downward, hurtling blindly through the freezing water. It slammed heavily into the sandy floor of the Barents Sea, coming to a shuddering halt 108 meters below the surface. The sheer weight of the ocean crushed against the steel, sealing their fate as the seabed swallowed the impact in a massive cloud of sand. But the true apocalyptic horror of the Kursk disaster did not occur during the impact. It occurred exactly 2 minutes and 15 agonizing seconds later. The initial blast had sparked a raging inferno in the forward section, where the submarine's fully armed combat torpedoes were stored. As the temperature inside the sealed metal tube rapidly soared to over 1,000 degrees Celsius, the inevitable occurred. Between 5 and 7 live, high-explosive warheads detonated simultaneously in the dark. The second explosion was of such unimaginable magnitude that delicate seismographs across northern Europe recorded it as a 2.2 magnitude earthquake. A blinding blast wave of localized hellfire ripped through the first 5 compartments of the shattered submarine. 95 highly trained sailors were instantly, painlessly vaporized in a fraction of a millisecond. The explosion tore a gaping, jagged hole in the thick steel pressure hull of the supposedly indestructible vessel. Millions of gallons of freezing, heavy ocean water rushed into the ship, immediately drowning the inferno. For the 95 men in the forward sections, the war was over. Their end was absolute. But the mighty Kursk was not completely dead. At the very rear of the shattered submarine, isolated from the blast wave by heavy steel doors, lay compartment number 9. By a terrifying miracle of naval engineering, 23 men had somehow survived the cataclysmic explosions. Fleeing the rapidly rising water and toxic smoke, they desperately sealed themselves inside this small, cramped metal room at the tail end of the ship. Among them was 27-year-old Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, who bravely took command of the stranded survivors. To truly understand the suffocating nature of claustrophobia, you must psychologically place yourself inside Compartment 9. You are trapped inside a tiny damp metal box, exactly 108 meters beneath the crushing weight of the Arctic Ocean. The main electrical power has completely failed. The massive nuclear reactors have shut down to prevent a meltdown. The absolute darkness is broken only by the faint blood-red glow of a few dying battery-powered emergency lights. The temperature of the dark water outside is a freezing 3 degrees Celsius, and the steel walls are rapidly absorbing that lethal cold. You cannot simply open the escape hatch and swim upward to the surface. At 108 meters deep, the sheer atmospheric pressure of the ocean would instantly crush your lungs and dissolve the nitrogen in your blood. You're buried alive in the most hostile, unforgiving environment on the planet. Time loses its absolute meaning. Minutes stretch into agonizing hours, marked only by the rhythm of your own shivering breaths. The silence of the deep ocean presses against the hull, creating a heavy, suffocating blanket of complete isolation. Your only option is to sit in the dripping dark, listen to the groaning metal hull, and pray for the sound of a rescue submersible. In the terrifying darkness, Captain Kolesnikov used a faint flashlight to write a hauntingly calm note on a scrap of wet paper. It is 13:15. All personnel from Sections 6, 7, and 8 have moved to Section 9. There are 23 of us here. None of us can get to the surface. They were terrified, freezing to the bone, but they were alive. And against all rational odds, they still had hope. But 108 meters above their shivering heads, a sickening display of political hubris and bureaucratic paranoia was unfolding. The top brass of the Russian Navy Command took hours to even realize their prized submarine was missing from the logs. When they finally located the sunken Leviathan, they launched a series of desperately inadequate rescue attempts. They deployed their outdated, poorly maintained prize-class rescue submersibles, machinery that belonged to a forgotten Soviet era. Again and again, the fragile Russian rescue vehicles repeatedly failed to create a proper vacuum seal against the Kursk's escape hatch. The Russian commanders blamed strong underwater currents. They blamed poor visibility. They blamed interference from foreign spy submarines. They blamed absolutely everything except their own crumbling, underfunded naval infrastructure. Watching the tragic disaster unfold on global news, the highly equipped navies of Great Britain and Norway offered their advanced deep-sea rescue vehicles. They had the cutting-edge technology and the divers. They could have easily reached the trapped men in a few short hours, but the Russian government, paralyzed by lingering Cold War paranoia and a deeply arrogant fear of exposing military secrets, did the unthinkable. They stubbornly and callously refused the international help, shutting the door on their own drowning men. They confidently insisted to the global media and to the weeping mothers and wives waiting desperately on the freezing docks of Vidyayevo that they had the situation entirely under control. They claimed that acoustic communication had been established and that the crew was being steadily supplied with fresh air and emergency power. It was a fatal, purely political lie, paid for entirely with the final gasping breaths of the 23 men trapped in the dark. Down below, deep within the freezing belly of Compartment 9, the invisible enemy of time was rapidly running out. The air inside the sealed room was growing incredibly thick, heavy and foul-smelling. With every single terrified exhale, the desperate men were consuming their limited oxygen and replacing it with lethal carbon dioxide. Icy condensation dripped heavily from the freezing steel ceiling, mixing with the oily seawater that was inevitably rising on the floor. Agonizing headaches began to violently set in. Vision blurred into dark, narrowing tunnels. Every movement required a monumental, agonizing effort. The paralyzing lethargy of oxygen deprivation slowly took hold of their exhausted bodies, whispering to them to simply close their heavy eyes and drift into a permanent sleep. To survive the wait for a rescue that was never coming, the men relied on a primitive, highly dangerous chemical life support system. They possessed several volatile superoxide cartridges, heavy oxygen generators that, when activated, scrubbed carbon dioxide from the stale air. It was a brilliant piece of chemistry, but the violent reaction inside these heavy metal cartridges generated dangerous levels of thermal heat. In the absolute freezing darkness, shivering uncontrollably and losing their cognitive functions to the bad air, a fatal mistake was made. 3 men, their hands slick with oil, carefully attempted to reload the oxygen generation machine with a fresh chemical cartridge. But in the fumbling pitch-black dark, the heavy cylinder slipped slightly from a pair of numb hands. It fell heavily, almost in slow motion, tumbling down into the shallow pool of dirty seawater on the metal floor. The resulting chemical reaction was instantaneous, devastating, and purely apocalyptic. When the superoxide chemical met the oily seawater, it triggered a massive, blinding flash fire inside the tiny sealed room. The chemical fire burned with an unnatural, ferocious intensity, feeding hungrily on the very elements that were supposed to save them. A wall of intense yellow and orange flame erupted in the dark, illuminating the terrified faces of the men for one final second. The sudden explosion of flames did not kill the 23 men with searing heat or concussive force. It killed them with basic chemistry. The flash fire instantly, hungrily consumed every single remaining molecule of precious oxygen in a matter of seconds. It violently converted the breathable air into thick, toxic, suffocating black clouds of carbon monoxide. In an instant, the very last flickering, desperate hope of Compartment 9 was extinguished forever. The 23 surviving heroes of the Kursk were choked to death in the pitch-black dark, asphyxiated in the sanctuary they had fought to reach. It took several more days of humiliating international pressure before the Russian government finally swallowed its bruised pride. They allowed the highly trained Norwegian deep-sea divers to descend to the silent, dark wreck. Equipped with advanced technology, the Norwegians swiftly approached the aft escape hatch of the blackened submarine. It took the foreign divers exactly 25 minutes to successfully open the heavy steel hatch that the Russian Navy had struggled with for a week. But as the rusted steel door slowly swung open into the dark sea, no rush of warm, stale air greeted them. There were no desperate, thankful voices echoing from the dark corridor. Only the silent, freezing, completely pitch-black water of the Barents Sea flooded out, carrying the grim reality of the situation. They were far too late. The men of the Kursk had been dead for days. When the bodies of the 23 sailors were eventually recovered from the flooded tomb, forensic divers found Captain Kolesnikov's final crumpled note. It was tucked carefully, almost reverently, into the wet breast pocket of his dark naval uniform. The very last words written in the suffocating dark were a testament to unbreakable human endurance. They read, "It is dark here to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems like there are no chances. 10 to 20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Regards to everybody, no need to despair." The wrecked, shattered hull of the K-141 Kursk stands today as one of the most agonizing, heartbreaking monuments to the fatal flaw of human arrogance. We build magnificent machines of iron and fire. We proudly challenge the most hostile, terrifying environments in the universe. We convince ourselves, wrapped in our technology, that our engineering has somehow made us invincible gods. But the deep, cold ocean is always patiently waiting in the dark, entirely unimpressed by our titanium hulls and our political pride. We must accept that our metal and our arrogance are absolutely nothing compared to the crushing, eternal weight of the abyss. Those 118 brave souls did not just die because of a faulty microscopic weld in a practice torpedo. They died because political pride and bureaucratic secrecy were ultimately deemed more valuable than the desperate breath in their lungs. The deep sea is a quiet, unforgiving, and absolutely impartial judge, and it remembers every single human mistake. You are watching past Resurrected. Until the next stage, remember, the ocean does not negotiate with human pride. History is not dead. It only waits, silently floating in the crushing dark depths, waiting to be remembered.